The Open Window by H. Munro, SAKI. Once upon a time, in a small, charming village surrounded by rolling hills and lush meadows, stood a lovely house with a wide, inviting garden. This house was home to Mrs. Sappleton and her clever niece, Vera. One bright afternoon, a man named Frampton Nuttall came to visit, seeking peace and recovery from his nervous condition. "My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nuttall," said Vera, a composed young lady of 15. "In the meantime, you must try and put up with me." Frampton tried his best to say something polite to Vera, even though he felt quite anxious. He wondered if meeting new people like this would really help him relax. "My sister gave me letters of introduction to some people here," Frampton explained. "She thought it would be good for me to meet them while I stay in the countryside." Vera looked at him thoughtfully. "So, you know nothing about my aunt?" she asked. "Only her name and address," Frampton admitted. He was curious about Mrs. Sappleton, but didn't know much else. "Then you mustn't know about her great tragedy," said Vera softly. "Tragedy?" Frampton asked, surprised. In this peaceful place, it seemed hard to imagine anything tragic happening. "You might wonder why we keep that window open," said Vera, pointing to a large window that opened onto the garden. "It is quite warm today," said Frampton. "But does the open window have something to do with the tragedy?" "Yes," said Vera. 3 years ago, my aunt's husband and her 2 younger brothers went out through that window for their daily shooting trip. They never came back. They were lost in a treacherous bog out on the moor. Their bodies were never found. My poor aunt always thinks they will return someday, so she keeps the window open every evening, hoping they will walk in just as they used to. She always tells me about how her husband carried a white coat over his arm, and how Ronnie, her youngest brother, would sing, 'Birdie, why do you bound?' to tease her because it got on her nerves. Sometimes on quiet evenings like this, I get a creepy feeling that they will walk in through that window." As Vera spoke, her voice grew softer and sadder. Frampton felt a chill run down his spine. Just then, Mrs. Sappleton entered the room, bustling with energy. "I hope Vera has been keeping you entertained," she said cheerfully. "She has been very interesting," Frampton replied, trying to sound calm. "I hope you don't mind the open window," said Mrs. Sappleton. "My husband and brothers will be home soon, and they always come in this way. They've been out shooting today." Frampton felt uneasy as Mrs. Sappleton chatted away about the shooting and the countryside. He couldn't stop thinking about the tragic story Vera had told him. Suddenly, Mrs. Sappleton's eyes brightened. "Here they are at last," she exclaimed. "Just in time for tea." Frampton turned to look. To his horror, he saw 3 figures walking across the garden toward the window. They were carrying guns, and one of them had a white coat over his arm. A tired brown spaniel followed them closely. Frampton froze in fear, his heart pounding. "It's them," Vera whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Frampton couldn't stand it any longer. He grabbed his hat and stick and ran out of the house as fast as he could. He didn't stop until he was far away, breathing hard and shaking with fear. Back at the house, Mrs. Sappleton's husband and brothers walked in through the window, just as they always did. "Who was that man running away?" asked Mrs. Sappleton's husband, looking puzzled. "A most extraordinary man, a Mr. Nuttall," said Mrs. Sappleton. "He talked about his illnesses and then ran off without a word when you arrived. One would think he had seen a ghost." Vera smiled to herself. "I think it was the spaniel," she said calmly. "He told me he had a terrible fear of dogs. Once, he was chased by a pack of wild dogs and had to hide in a graveyard all night." Mrs. Sappleton laughed, not suspecting a thing. Thanks to Vera's love for storytelling, the mystery of the open window continued to delight and surprise those who visited this peaceful countryside. This story teaches an important lesson about considering multiple perspectives and not jumping to conclusions too quickly when judging a situation. The end.